Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to do this video lab with HTTP and asynchronous JavaScript. So here we'll have a lab dedicated to building out the contact form. So you might recall the contact form that you had from your portfolio page lab didn't do anything. This lab will go ahead and finish up that implementation so that we can actually use it to start collecting data from users who might submit onto it. And so here, the technologies we're going to learn to use is we're going to learn about HTTP requests. In particular, we're going to be making post requests to some backend service. The backend service will be one that's managed by Google. So we're just going to focus on being clients to HTTP requests and responses. We're just going to focus on being web clients. And we're going to learn we'll learn how to do that in both HTML, using forms and submit events. And we're going to learn how to use that using asynchronous JavaScript without having to use any HTML. So we'll learn how to use those two technologies to send requests to a web server. Okay, so this is a relatively short lab. We'll have our quick little introduction that goes over all of the learning objectives, and then it'll be broken down into 5 separate goals. The first of goal will be essentially to create a Google form as our backend database of sorts. And then the rest of it will actually be building out our on client side as just a collection of HTML and JavaScript files. And so the goal 2 here would be to create all of the implementation just in HTML. And then we'll slowly transition away from HTML and see how we could do the same things using JavaScript. So we use the JavaScript document object to set the data into the HTML form, but then we'll still use the form on goal 3. And then on goal 4, we'll see how we can encapsulate the data that's going to be sent to the web server using JavaScript, but we'll still use the form submit action to send the data. And then the 5th and final goal, we'll use exclusively asynchronous JavaScript to send that HTTP request without having to implement anything from the HTML side and use any of the built-in kind of browser functionality that's kind of hard-coded into forms. And then we'll just have our little bit of concluding notes after that. Oh yeah, it's a beautiful day outside and you're hearing the wind chimes likely on the porch. So in terms of our lab introduction, the prereq for this is, well, this is probably the first time we actually have a prereq that isn't just a browser and an IDE. Uh-oh, I feel like
required to train the model.
I'm hearing myself here. And in fact, let me do this. In fact, we'll go ahead and put.
I think that was my bad. I wasn't muted.
Okay. So this will be the first lab that we actually have a prereq to. So this will be the first lab in probably a sequence. I think we have one other lab where we'll be doing asynchronous JavaScript. But you'll also require having a Google account for this lab since we're going to rely on Google as our backend service. So the motivation behind this lab is we want to learn to use HTTP to send requests to a backend service. I'm not going to use headphones. This lab focuses exclusively on client side. Thus, we'll send HTTP requests to a pre-existing backend, which is why we're going to select Google for this instance. We'll be doing the same thing on the next lab as well. We'll find some backend RESTful API that we can make calls to, and then we'll focus on learning how to make web calls and getting that data back from a web server on the client side. And once we get comfortable with that, we're going to pivot and start building our own web servers that can do just that, so that we'll be able to design them. But I feel like before we start designing them, we should use them a little bit so we get comfortable with what their role is, what job they do for us, for our web applications. So our goal for this lab is to implement that contact form on our portfolio page, and to store the data that gets submitted from the contact form into a Google form. So the learning objectives that we'll cover will be HTTP requests. In particular, we're going to be doing post request. In a future lab, we'll learn a couple of different types of requests, like GET request and delete requests and put requests. We're going to learn the Async Await keywords that allows us to do asynchronous calls to JavaScript. And and I'll talk more about what it means to be asynchronous versus non-asynchronous calls. But pretty much the basic takeaway about async JavaScript versus, or in any language actually, versus non-asynchronous calls is in non-asynchronous calls is what you're typically used to. If you're building an algorithm that has a collection of statements, there's the expectation that it gets executed statement by statement by statement. But there are some actions that can occur that you have to wait for them before you can go ahead and trigger a response. And so probably the most common form of asynchronous programming you're used to is event-driven, where we set up a listener and we wait for an event to happen, and then we handle that event with a callback function. That is a form of asynchronous implementation. No. Well, so that concept extends to when we have a web client having to communicate with a web server. So when a web client sends a request to a web server, it's going to be a non-trivial amount of time to get back a response. The response might take a second, it might take 15 seconds, but what you want to do inside of your client-side app is wait for the server to send back a response, and then you're going to do whatever you want to do with that response, with that data that it provides back to you. And we're going to see how we can send that request today to the to a server. So that's effectively what Async Await is used for. It allows us to be able to send out like a asynchronous call, like a fetch call, like a request to a server, and then wait for a response to happen, and then manage the response once we've gotten it. So with that said, a fetch method is an asynchronous call. Fetches are a built-in method on our JavaScript library that allows us, inside of the API, that allows us to send HTTP requests. Before the fetch method, we would have had to use third-party tooling to do that. Or again, another way to send a HTTP request would be through an HTML form, which is going to be the first goal that we do. And then also we'll talk about what promises are in JavaScript. And again, there's a lecture that you should watch that talks about all these concepts. So this lab is the companion lab to those lectures. And hopefully sometime next week, I'll go ahead and publish a quiz so that you can go ahead and evaluate your knowledges on those. Okay, so a quick overview. Well, I think this overview here is exactly as the table of contents, so I will not go over that. And our project architecture is we're going to have a main directory that we'll call contact form. Inside of a contact form, we'll have our index.html page, and then we'll have a scripts subdirectory that's going to hold all of our scripts. And I don't think that this is correct, actually. I think we're only going to build 2 scripts for this. We're going to have a form controller and a form model. I don't think we need a form view. And I don't think we need form data, because we'll just put our data inside of the model. So I think that I might have to update that. But notice there's nothing to download here. And this just means that we're going to make everything. There's no assets for this lab, so we get to make everything from scratch. So actually, let me start with that. Let's let me go into here. So I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call it what was it? Contact form. Perfect. And inside a contact form, I'm going to create a scripts folder. Perfect. And let's see here. Let's also, so yeah, contact form now exists. So let me go change into contact form from my terminal, and I'm going to create that index.html. Perfect. And then I'm going to change into scripts, because probably anything I'm going to have to make thereafter is going to be inside of my scripts directory. Perfect. And okay. And let's open this up here because we know we're going to have to effectively, oh my. Okay, perfect. Okay, so now goal one, well, before we start implementing anything, we're going to need a Google form made to do this. So there's one of two ways we can do this. So first, let's define our goal. We're going to create a Google form to store our contact data, submissions that the user is going to want to supply to us. So the approach is we're going to use a pre-existing backend service to store our form data. So Google provides access to post form data as long as you have a Google account. So Google has a lot of really great services under Google Drive. One of them is Google Docs, and Google Forms is a part of Google Docs. So we'll be using Google Forms, and I'll show you one of two ways that we can go ahead and get to the Forms page there. Some concepts we're going to learn in this particular iteration is we're going to learn a little bit about backend services. So up till this point, we've been using the web client, which is our browser. And we've just been using it kind of as a viewport and a JavaScript runtime environment. But now we're going to use it in a way that it's intended to be used, right? To be able to also connect with web servers. So we're going to learn to submit data to a backend server that will then store the data that we submit to it as data persistence. So you can think of this as a rudimentary database of sorts. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a concept of endpoints, and all an endpoint is you could think of it as as the URL that we have to send our request to. So effectively, a web server is listening on some route for typically a particular type of HTTP verb. So either like a get verb or a put verb or a delete verb or a post verb. We're going to be using post today. And so when it's issued an action and some data, then it can go ahead and receive that request and then process back a response and send that back to the web client. So here we're just going to define this as the URL route and HTTP verb that the server listens to in order to be able to send and receive HTTP request. Well, it receives HTTP requests. It sends back responses. So you can think of it as a client-server relationship, which is clearly why it's called the web client web server. Anyway, let's get to the next step is why don't we open up a Chrome browser and go to forms.google.com. So this is probably the easiest way if you want to get to forms, right? You can just go and select to create a blank form. So this is one way to do it. I'm going to show you an alternate way, and I'm actually just going to use the alternate way. If you open up Google Drive, you can also create a new Google document, and one of the options will be to create a Google form. So those are the two ways. I'm going to give it a name really quick. Let's call this contact form. Perfect. Okay, so now I have this contact form made. The next thing I want to do is I want to fill in the Google form with all the required input fields that we're going to need. And so ideally, it would have the same input forms that my portfolio page would have, right? Let's see, I called this contact response. Okay. Oh, not what I want. Let me be consistent with the lab. So I'll call this contact response. Perfect. And so I'm going to create a name, email, and message. So let's do that. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say, make a name. I notice Google's actually form UI is smart enough to know if I put in name, it probably wants this to be a short answer. Perfect. Then I'm going to go and create a new question. So I'm going to hit the plus sign. And then I'm going to do email. And again, it's probably smart enough to know to make this a short answer. But if it didn't, I can select any of the options I want my form to have. Then I'm going to hit this plus sign to add a new question. And then I'm going to do a message. Excellent. So now at this point, I now have a form that has a name, email, and message. And actually, just to test this out, I can click on that preview icon. So it's the eyeball icon. So let's do that. Let's go to this eyeball, and it'll allow me to go from the editing pane to the view pane on it. So now this is what others would see if I were to share this form with them. And I can actually test this out. Let me actually submit. So let me say, for instance, Ted, and let's say that this is Ted at ted.com, and test 1, 2, 3. Okay, perfect. So let's just test. We're going to do a submit. We'll see that Google gives us back a redirect that shows that we've actually sent a request and it's been recorded. If I go back into my directory here, where I have my contact form, let me go back into here where I have my contact form here, where I'm in the editing pane. Notice I have up here the ability to see the questions and to see my responses. And here it shows that I have one response. And then I also have a settings pane where I can adjust some of the settings stuff. So I'm going to go to the responses here, and I'll see that my response is right here. So for name, email, and message, I have Ted at ted.com, and test 1, 2, 3. Perfect. And in fact, if I select to create a spreadsheet, I can click this. It's going to say, do you want to create a new spreadsheet? Well, yeah, go ahead and create that. And then it's going to aggregate all the results into this spreadsheet. So here's another way I can pull this data, where it gives me the timestamp that the submission occurred on. And then it has a name column, an email column, and a message column. And again, this is all just built into Google Forms as part of Google Docs. Okay, so we've played around with this a little bit. Now let's see what else. So let's move on to the next step, now that we've actually built a form that we can use to collect data, because at this point, this is going to serve as kind of our database, right? This is where we're going to get our data persistence at for capturing whatever data that we want the users to submit so that we can archive it. So here, in order for me to go ahead and have my own web page interconnect with Google Forms, I need to get some data from Google Forms. So we're going to do this intermediary step that's going to pull some necessary things. And so just so you can see what's happening here. Oh. Okay, so just so we can see what's happening here, let me actually do this. Oh, let me open up. Let's go back to that view. And let me go to here. I'm going to go to view source. Okay, so if we view source, you could see these generated forms look awful, right? It's all a single line of HTML. Oh, Lord. Okay, so I went through the work of finding where the name values are. And so we're going to step through this code, but and see what actually happens. So actually, why don't we grab this? I will go to here. Let me go to the eyeball again. So here, where the form actually exists, that such that we can submit to it. Oh, let me clear this. Okay, and let's grab this a line at a time, and I'll explain what each of these things are doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a function. Okay, and what's this function doing? Okay, let's get this. Let's do it from the. Okay, so this is a function called print label. So this is I'm creating a function declaration. A function assignment. So print label is the name of the function, and I'm assigning to it. So given a parameter I, you can think of I as an index. I'm going to use the document object model, and I'm going to use the query selector all method on there. So one of the function calls we've seen a lot for the document object model is get element by ID. Well, this is an alternative way that we can get elements from our DOM And so what this allows us to do is it allows us to use all sorts of selectors. So effectively, anything that can qualify as a CSS selector, we can use to select elements from JavaScript. So this is a very powerful mechanism to search our DOM. If you want to know more about Query Selector All, you can go again to the Mozilla developer page, and you'll see that they have an entire selection for the document query selector. But there's some interesting ways that we can define some selectors. One of them is we can actually match based off of attribute. So let me see here where I can show you in the literature here. So this is the example here, which is called an attribute selector. So what you'll see here, what I'm doing is I'm going to, on the document, use query selector all, and then inside of the square brackets, so inside the string is what I'm selecting on. If I define the thing in square brackets, then I'm looking for an HTML element by an attribute that it has. So here I'm looking for an attribute called aria level, and here the symbol of whatever that hat equal sign allows me to look at the first part of a value and make a decision. So here, just so we could see, based off of the W3 specification, if we have an attribute. So again, these are the different ways we can match an attribute with our query selector all. So inside of our square brackets, right, you have an attribute name, and let's say you have the hat equal to, and then a value. Well, this represents an element with the attribute whose value begins with a prefix of whatever this value is. If I did $, equal sign, a helicopter passing by. If we do $, equal to, then that represents an element who has the attribute value at the end of whatever the value we're searching for is. And if we do star equal, then it's going to look for at least one instance of a substring. So these are identifying based off of substrings. So here, hat equal is the first part of the substring. The $ equal is the back end of the substring, and star equal is anywhere inside the string. So to give you an idea, is here the attribute would be type in the HTML, and then hat equal would be looking for a substring that starts with image /. So if you're looking for a specific like folder, this would be a great way to do that. Whereas if you're doing $ equal and you're looking for the href attribute in an HTML element, you might want to check for any references that are at the end of the substring, right? That end in .html. So this allows you to look for an extension. And so here, if you use star equal, you can look for any instance within a substring that just has the word hello. It could be at the beginning, it could be at the end, it could be somewhere in the middle. So that's just giving you an idea of what these symbols mean. So that way, when you look at this, it's not all just foreign code to you. You can kind of decipher it. And again, if after looking at this doesn't make any sense, please let me know what part might still be confusing. Anyway, so here we're creating a variable called print label, and we're assigning to it a function object using fat arrow notation. It takes a parameter of I to represent an index. We're going to make a call to the document query selector all to get all document objects that have an aria level of 3, and then we'll index into that because that's going to return back an HTML collection. As you might recall, it's going to return all the elements back, even if there's only one, even if it's then it's going to be one inside of an HTML collection. So we'll index into the particular index that we want and grab the inner text of it. So we'll get what is at the text of this HTML element. We'll talk about what is happening here in just a moment. Then the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and create a function called print entry. And again, this is going to be a function assignment. So this is going to take 2 parameters. Now, notice one thing when we declare a function object, if it's 1 parameter, you don't have to use parentheses. That's implied. But if there's 2 parameters, then you have to go ahead and use parentheses. So the parameter list here is an E and an I. The E represents an element and the I will represent an index. And here, all we're doing here is we're console logging. So here we're invoking the print label function we just defined right above it, and we're passing in the I that gets past the print entry. And here, E is an element, an HTML element. So we're going to access that element's name attribute. So the name attribute is going to be an important concept in the fact that just like on the client side, we have an ID attribute we can define to an HTML value so that we can reference it on the client side. The name attribute is what we give to an HTML element to give data that we want to send to a web server, to how we refer to it. So the name will be used effectively like an ID on the server side. So that's going to be like the distinguishing factors between ID and name. So an HTML element can have both those things, and they can be 2 different values. You can have an ID that has 1 value. You could have a name as another value. On your client side, you might refer to that HTML element as its ID. And then on the server side, it might use that HTML element's data using the name property. So it allows us to have like a separation of responsibility. IDs are for client, names are for server, sending to the server. Okay. So then what we're going to do, so these are just 2 functions. This isn't doing anything yet. In fact, if I were to copy this code here and paste that in, you'll see. And in fact, let's test this out. So if I do print label, and if I do an index of 0, let's see what it returns back. Print label. Oh, I got to. There we go. Camelback notation. Print label is not defined. Print. Oh, hate autocomplete sometimes. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if I do print label 0, notice what it's doing here right off the bat is it's searching the DOM and it's giving me back this label right here. So it's giving me the labels of the forms. So if I do print label 1, it's going to give me email right here. And if I do print label 2, it's going to give me message. So we can see what this first method is doing is it's returning back the labels. Now, I can't quite use the print entry yet because the print entry requires an HTML element and an index. So we're going to see how we're going to be able to make a function call to that. Now, you might be wondering, yeah?
Can you explain what ARIA level is? Is that one more time, like ARIA level?
So ARIA, so the fact that this is inside of brackets lets me know, hey, this is an attribute that belongs to an HTML element. Now, ARIA level just happens to be an attribute that belongs to these form elements inside of Google Forms. Now, this is proprietary knowledge, though. This is domain-specific knowledge. This is not a general name that you will typically need to know. This ARIA level attribute just so happens to be the attribute that Google uses to identify their forms here. And since we're going to use Google's backend, it behooves us to be able to get this data. We're going to need this data to connect to our own form. So I kind of did the legwork to see how I can essentially gather this information from the Google form so we'll be able to use it. But to see where ARIA level is actually defined at, actually, let's go back to here.
Yeah, that's more of what I was asking.
Yeah, let me go to Control F, and you'll see here ARIA level. I'll do a find. I'll do a find on this document, and notice ARIA level equals 3. It actually found it 3 times. If I had, and it's going to find it for every instance that you have a question in a Google form. So if I do the first time, there it is. And look at what the inner TXT is to this HTML element. So you'll see this HTML element that has the ARIA level 3 is a div, right? I see it's a div element. It has an ID that's randomly generated. So it's going to be different for every form. So I can't use that to identify this form value. It uses this class that, look at this. This is a random sequence of alphanumeric characters. This changes every time. I can't use that either. I can't use the role to identify this because lots of roles have the heading value. So one unique thing that Google applies to each and every one of those questions on a form is this ARIA level attribute. And so we're going to take advantage of that. We're going to say, hey, each time I want to find one of these questions inside of our Google form, there's this ARIA level. There's the first one for our name. There's the other one for our other label, email, and there's the other one for our message. So if I want to be able to get those forms to ensure that those are the forms that we're looking for, that those are the input fields that we're looking for, we can verify it by looking through the DOM for any instance of ARIA level and see, okay, I found the message field, I found the message label, the email label, and the name label. And again, on the rendered HTML, what it's looking at here is this, and this. Does that make sense?
Yes. So if we're going to use query selector, we can't just use ARIA level. We have to actually look through the code and find what our unique identifier is.
Well, so for this code, you can just use this code as it were, because I did the legwork of finding that all the HTML elements in Google Docs, the ones in order to get the labels so that we can identify what the names are. So what we need to do, this is what our goal here right now is, in order to send data to a web server, we need to name that data. And that name has to be the same on the client side as it is on the server side. So when we create a form on Google Forms, typically you're using the front end that Google designed, and it randomly generates the names. So we need to find the randomly generated names for this field here, for this field here, and this field here, for the name field, for the email field, and the message field. Because if we send a request to Google Forms and we use the same names as what this contact form is using, it'll post in the same way. Does that make sense? Does that explanation make sense?
Yes.
And it'll make more sense as we're actually implementing, I think, the code as well. So, in fact, when I run this, I think you'll get a better sense of what's happening. But what I'm doing initially is just to make sure that the name attribute matches what we expect it to be, we're going to also print the label. And so this function is just looking for where the label is inside this Google form so that we can print it out. And you could see, like when I made these method calls, print label for index 0, it found the name label and it printed it out, right? It printed the inner text. And all it was doing there was, this was the inner text, right? The inner text of the element that had ARIA level 3. And so I printed out, so index 0 was name, index 1 was email, and index 2 was message. Inside of the HTML collection that we got back from the document object model from this first one. And then here, this is just a console log. There's nothing special happening here. So let's do this again, actually. Why don't we do entry list? So let me go back over here and actually let me clear. Okay, so now let me do entry list here. So what is this? I'm going to make a call to the document object model again. I'm going to use the query selector all, which is another way of getting elements from my DOM. And so just so everyone's on the same page, if I ever want to inspect my in-memory DOM, I can do that from the dev tools hitting the elements tab. This is effectively the DOM constructed in memory for this page. So this is essentially what I'm getting access to and have function calls on. Okay, and then I'm going to do a very similar thing here. Here, I'm going to try to select from the document object model that is this page, any HTML element that has the name attribute. And remember, what I stated earlier is you have a name attribute when you're looking to send data to a web server. So that means since this has a field that will have a value that's designed to go to Google's backend server that creates that Excel document or the spreadsheet document, and that collects the responses, this field has to have a name associated with it. So does this email field, and so does this message field. So I'm going to tell the document, okay, return all the HTML elements that have a name attribute, but in particular, the name attribute that starts with entry. Because what Google, again, when Google Forms generates these front ends for us, when it generates these questions for us, it gives it a randomly generated name. But the one consistent thing about these randomly generated names is that they all are prefixed with the entry term, so that you know this is an entry into the form. And so when the web server gets a response from this form, when this form is submitted, it's going to send essentially as a query string a keys that start with entry and then a random set of numbers. And then the value would be the value we put into this form for name, and the value that we put into the form for email, and the value that we put into the form for message. So actually, let me go ahead and just run this. And here, let me go back into here. So let me prove to you, if I type in entry inside of here, let's see what happens. Entry. You can see there's lots of entries. Okay, so first of all, see there's, well, here, oh Lord, it's probably not even capturing it here. What can I do this? Oh, not equal sign. Okay, so is it able to find anything? No, I can't even find it on here. So I'll probably have to go into, no, only 2 instances of entry. Oh, what about name? Oh, and you can see there's lots of, okay, name. Yeah, you can see all these generate. So we can't find it by name attribute. That's why we want to look for that prefix of entry. And yeah, and it's not even rendering inside of this page when I go to look at the view source on it. So I might actually have to look for that inside of the, well, why don't we look inside of here though? So let me do this call and let me look at entry list. So look, what my entry list shows is, hey, there were 3 matches from our DOM, right? Because we got a node list here. There's 3 matches from your DOM that has an attribute called name, and that starts with the label of entry, and they're all inputs. Well, guess what? That's great, because there's 3 inputs on this page. And if I unpack this and I look at the index, I'm like, oh yeah, look at this. This is a this is the name. So it's got the label name. It's got entry.17843 65446. So this is the name. Oh, oh yeah, here it is. So this is the name we're going to have to use to send to the web server if we want to go ahead and submit onto this name field. And let's go. Okay, let me recollapse this. Let me go into input 1 here. Here, notice this name has a different entry, and that represents the email field. And then here, let's unpack this. This name attribute has the value of entry 0.14610688812. And of course, these entries are all going to be different for you, but that's going to correspond to my message fields here. So we need, this is information we need to know to send data. You can think of these as the IDs, the identifiers that will allow us to set a name, an email, and message data into our web server. So we need to collect that information. And that's what this script does effectively. So now I have this. And in fact, let's finish that one line of code here. Let me go back here. And then I'm just going to, now one thing you're going to see here is what I got back is a node list. And this node list kind of looks like it is an array, but it's not an array, right? It's actually a node list. It's an object. And unfortunately, it's not an enumeratable object such that we can call our array functions on it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to learn some of the techniques we learned in the JavaScript data structures lecture, where we can go ahead and take this this object and deconstruct it into a collection of values. And then we will wrap it in square brackets, which will then cast it into an array. So by deconstructing it and then defining those individual elements into a collection, we now have an array that is now suitable for calling array method calls. So for each of these input elements inside of this node list, we will invoke the print entry method. And remember, the print entry method, what is happening there is, let's look back at the source code, giving an element. So that will be an input element and an index value. Then we will print the label at the index value, and we will print the name attribute of our input element. So let me go ahead and do that. Go ahead and run that line of code, and you're going to see the output that I get from this code now is the name field. So the thing that has a name label has a HTML name of entry.17843654446. And the email has entry 15295700185, and the message has entry 1461068 whatever 8812. So this is just information we need to have, but we kind of stepped through to illustrate how we're getting that from this document. But again, this is all very specific to this individual problem, but you could see how we start to use JavaScript in interesting ways to be able to do some data collection that we need to interface with effectively their backend service. Okay, so we've done that now. We've gotten this output, and notice the example output is different than what I'm doing now, and it's going to be different from what you're doing. We can think of these entries as our endpoints, though. We need these entry names to send to Google's backend so that we can actually set the values inside of the form, because the form is looking for these specific names to be able to set data to that value. Essentially, you can think of that as the variable names of the form on the server side. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we actually need to get the form's ID so that we can add that as part of our endpoint URL. So the form ID is going to be different for every Google form. This step may be achieved in two ways. We can either the easiest way is to use the URL address from our top bar, or we could also query the DOM for the ID of the form. So what does it? So here, effectively, this here, when you look inside of the URL bar, what I have highlighted is the ID for this form. In order to actually submit data to this form, we need the form ID as presented by Google. And again, this is a domain-specific problem. This is just information we need in order to interact with Google's server. And since that's the backend we've selected, it's information we'll have to collect. Okay, so what's the other way we can do it? Well, I can create this function, and I'll actually walk through what this function is doing. So let me go back over here. Let me clear. Do I want to clear this? Yeah, I can clear this because I can always get that information back. Okay, so here I'm going to grab the ID. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to call document.location.href, and I'm going to match. So locations href is going to return this. In fact, let's take a look at what this is going to. First of all, let's take a look at document.location.href. Let's see what that is. So if you notice, that's actually the URL that we're currently at. Now I can actually, on any string, do a regex match. So what the string you see here that I'm matching against would be the same way that I could do any other regex. So I think if you do system programming concepts, you learn a little bit about regex. Is that correct? Okay. So effectively, this is just so what a regex is. It's a regular expression. It allows me to define attributes to look for on a substring. So the regex command that I'm looking for here is just find a string that's width is 25 or larger. And the only thing inside of the URL that's going to be 25 characters or larger is going to be the ID. So if I look at the ID, then you're going to see, oh yeah, that's the ID that I just assigned. In fact, here, let me actually get the other part of this code where I'll actually just go ahead and print out the ID. So here, I will just then, there's my ID. So those are the two ways I can now, and you'll see what you'll see here is that's the same thing that's inside the URL. So I can either just copy paste from the URL, or I could do it programmatically, right? And I always like to do things programmatically so we can see how we can achieve those results. Okay, so those are the, oh, that's not what I want. Those are the two pieces of data that we'll really need in order to submit our own form to Google's backend to add it with the submissions that we've generated on that document, on that form document. Okay, so now a quick summary is we need the ID of the form, we need the name, we need the email, we need the message. Once we have that, then we can actually start building our own form on our client side. So the next goal is let's actually send a request to the HTML form. Let's use the HTML form element to submit from our client data to that backend service. So the first approach we're going to do this for is just exclusively HTML. So you can see how we can send data from an HTML document from client side to a web server without the use of JavaScript. So again, we'll use HTML to submit data to the backend service, i.e. our backend service is going to be Google Docs. HTML has a form tag that can submit requests to an HTTP server. An HTTP request requires an action, which is effectively a URL endpoint, and it requires a method, which is going to be an HTTP verb. So the method would be get, post, put, or delete. Those are the four methods we have access to. We want to post data to the Google spreadsheet, so we're going to be using a post method. So again, the concepts that we're really going to be looking at here on iteration 2 is going to be, is that, I think I'm getting a white noise on my speakers. We're going to look at building a front end service. So our front end service is effectively going to be UI UX, our user interface, where the browser maintains views and controllers that the user interacts with. We're going to learn a little bit how to do a submit event. And this is where the user triggers a request from the web client to the web server. And that request is triggered by a submit event that occurs in the browser generated by the form element. We'll learn about the request itself. Recall or know, if you don't know already, that HTTP or the Hypertext Transfer Protocol is the protocol that browsers use to send requests to web servers. And this is the pretty standard protocol that we use. We'll learn an alternate protocol called WebSocket sometime in the future, but this is a request response model. So we have a client that sends a request, the web server parses the request and then sends back a response to the web client. And then the connection's terminated after that. So the client always initiates the request, and then the server will send a response and then disconnect after that. And then if the client needs more information, it'll send a new request. And then we're going to learn how to use the form tag. We've seen the form tag, but we're going to learn the functionality that the form tag provides to us. And it's really that the HTML form can trigger those submit events to send those HTTP requests to a web server. Okay, so the stages we're going to have here is we're going to, inside of our index.html, we're going to go ahead and we have to set all the same inputs that our Google form expects. That's our backend. So why don't we create a HTML document that has all of that data. So here, I'm going to create a form. The action is going to be where I send my, where the URL to where I'm sending that request to. So notice this is going through Google Docs. I needed the form ID to go here, and notice /form response is the endpoint that Google uses to get form data at. So every time you hit the submit button here, where that's actually submitting to is that form request URL. So actually, let me grab this really. Let me grab it from here. So I'm going to grab this ID. Is it highlighted? I can't tell. Oh, there we go. So let me grab this ID because I'm going to need that inside of here. Oh, nope. Okay, perfect. So now I have the ID and I'm sending it to form request, and it's going to be a post method. And then here, I'm going to then inside of my form, going to create these divs that's going to have an input, and the input's going to be type text, and it's going to have placeholder value inside the field, and then it needs the name, and that name has to be the name that the web server is looking for us to impute data into. So it's going to be the first entry that we saw. And then I'm going to create another div that's going to be another input field that's going to be for emails, and it has the placeholder email. I'll make another div that's a text area that is 4 rows, and it's going to have a placeholder of message. So let me go ahead and also get those entries. Clear this. And let me get that line of code back here where I'm printing out these. So the one for name is going to be this one. So let me copy that and paste that in here. Let me copy this and paste that in there. And let me copy this and paste that in there. Perfect. So now let me just see what this page is looking like so far. So if I go to my index HTML, I can go here, here, drag this in here. Oh, I have issues. Okay, so I have a form. Placeholder is how it says name in there. Placeholder is how I see email in there, and placeholder is how I see message in there. And this is a text field, and a text area that's 4 rows. And again, we've put in our names for our web server. So let's see what else we need to do for this step. Let's go back here, and then I just test it. So what's going to happen is when I click the submit button, notice I didn't have to set up an event handler or anything. The submit a click event on a button in a form automatically generates a submit event, and the submit event will send. Let me go back to my source code. The submit event is going to send. It's going to use action and method from the form. So it's going to submit the event to this URL, and it's going to submit with a post method. And it's going to send this data that has anything that has a name attribute. And it's going to send the value that's inside of these inputs as the value, and the key it's going to send to the server is going to be with this name. So the name or the keys and the values associated with these names are going to be whatever the user submits. So let me test this. This is client test 1. Email will be email@email.com test 1. Let's submit, and look at that. I got a redirect from the server. So I sent the request sent back a response, and the response forced a redirect to illustrate that my contact response was successful. So I just sent a request, an HTTP request from my client, from the browser, to Google's backend service, and it redirected me to their success page, their contact response page. So if I go back here towards the document, I see now I have 2 responses, right? I have client test 1, I have email@email.com, and I have test 1 here. And in fact, if I go to this Excel document, I can see there it is. It updated right there, where I now have a time, and I have a client, the name, I have the email, and I have the message. Excellent. So now we can see how easy it is in just HTML to send this, to send an HTTP request. But usually in our apps, we're not going to use HTML forms for this. We're going to want to learn how to start building these requests from JavaScript and sending them to backend servers in the background where it doesn't force redirects or anything. So here we notice it worked. The page did redirect to the Google response page, and the submitted data does appear on our Google spreadsheet. A disadvantage of this current approach, though, is that it offers no control in resolving our server responses, and everything is effectively hard-coded into our HTML. So again, that's not good programming practices, and maybe we don't want people to see that we are getting redirected to a Google form. We want to hide the fact that Google is our backend service, and that when someone sends a request, we get to control what the response that the user sees is. And again, we're going to address all that in these future goals. So the next thing I want to do here is, well, let's use asynchronous JavaScript to submit the user's data to the backend service. So the approach here is, well, we'll use JavaScript initially. So we'll slowly start implementing our solution to be 100% JavaScript, but we're going to focus on just using JavaScript to set the attributes for our HTML form. So that's what we're going to kind of reserve ourselves for just this iteration. So we're going to use JavaScript to submit data to the backend service, i.e. Google Docs. This approach is similar to the prior, except that the forms attributes will be set within JavaScript as opposed to being hard-coded into the HTML. The HTTP request is performed by the HTML form still. We're still going to use that submit event at this time for this iteration to send that data. So the concepts we're going to learn here are the form attributes from the DOM elements, from the HTML elements as they exist in JavaScript. So in order to submit an HTTP request, an HTML form must have an action, which is the URL, and it has to have a method, which is that HTTP verb. And the child values must be defined with name attributes that have a unique label to them. So again, the name attribute kind of represents an ID for the web server side of our application. And then we use the ID label as the client side ID for that data. And then again, we're going to create a submit listener. Since we're going to be setting this up in JavaScript, we'll see how we can add an event listener that listens for submit events. And a submit event listener may be set on a form and triggered by a child button when it's clicked or pressed. Okay, so let's actually do this. Let's go into our HTML form and let's update some things here. Here, I will just go ahead for now, for brevity's sake, I will update my form. Let's go over here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm still going to have my HTML form, but effectively I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it an ID so I can access it inside of JavaScript. I'm also going to give IDs to my input element. So my name input, I will give the ID of name. My email input element, I will give the ID of email, and my message element, I will give the ID of message. Now, recall, we need to give these names inside in order to send the data to the backend server, but I'm going to give the name attribute to these elements inside of JavaScript. So since we're going to rely on JavaScript to go ahead and do this, I'm going to have to include some JavaScript files. I'm going to break my logic between the controller and model. So I'm going to adhere to an MVC breakdown, right? Just like we did with our last project. So I'm going to create a form model and I'm going to create a form controller. And the controller will have everything for accessing DOM elements, and the model will have all the internal logic to be able to send out requests. So now let me create those. So I need a form model.js file, and I need a form controller.js file. So now let me go into my scripts here now that I've made those, and let's get these into my IDE. Excellent. Okay, so now that we're done with the HTML steps, let's take a look at the JavaScript steps we need to be able to implement this. The first is let's get all of the data we need, which is going to be the form ID and the entry 1, entry 2, and entry 3. Entry 1 is the name, entry 2 is the email, entry 3 is the message. And then we're also going to create a method that's going to be able to get a path and get path is effectively just going to be able for us to pass in a form ID, and it's going to generate the URL, the pathway to be able to send out a form response. So in fact, if I just want to test this out, so you can see what this look like, right? Now, if I call get path and I do like send in a test, it's going to send back it's going to produce a URL, and where the ID would go, that's where test is. I should put test ID here so we can see test ID. And just a programmatic way to generate this, so it's just easier for our code to kind of exist. So, oh, not what I want. Let's go back over here and actually let's add this. So this is effectively, we're going to initialize the data and a get path function that returns our path string. Okay, now I actually need to go back here. Uh-oh, I deleted all that stuff. So let me get my form ID again. I should have grabbed it while I had a chance. Okay, so this is my entry 1. So let me get entry 1. And I'm actually going to store it here as entry 1 inside of my script. And let me get here entry 2. That's my email. There we go. And then let me get here entry 3. Okay, so now this should actually correspond with the actual document I want to submit on. Also, let me get that ID, and I'll just grab it here this time since it's available. Copy that from the URL bar, and we will update this there. Excellent. Okay, so now I have the data for the form that I just generated. So the next thing, let's go into our controller and add some controller logic. We want to add a submit listener to the HTML form via the DOM. So I'm going to create effectively a method that initializes all my controllers. Let's take a look at this. So I'm going to create a method called Init Controllers, which is just a function. What this is going to do is it's going to grab the contact form from the document using the get element by ID method call, and it's going to store the HTML element in memory, and then it's going to take that and it's going to add an event listener where it's going to listen for a submit event to occur, and it's going to bind the callback function submit event to that, and then I'm going to invoke init controllers so that it actually goes and adds that event listener, and then the next thing I'm going to do is actually define what that submit event does. So let's go ahead and define that behavior. So I want init controllers to be the last line of code. So I'm going to, in between init controllers and the invocation of it, I'm now going to paste my my callback function. So my callback function submit event is going to grab, it's going to access from the document the element, the input element with the ID of name, and then it's going to access the name attribute. And it's going to assign the name attribute, the value from entry 1. And then it's going to do the same thing for the input element that has the ID of email. It's going to access the name attribute of it, and it's going to give it entry 2, the value of entry 2. And then it's going to do the same thing for the message input. It's going to access the name attribute, and it's going to assign it the value from entry 3. Then after I do that, I'm going to go ahead and access the form with the ID contact form. Recall that's going to be our form right here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass the form ID to get path. That's going to generate the path that we need so that we can set inside of the contact form. Remember, for a submit event to occur to send data to a web server, we need 2 pieces of data. We need an action attribute and we need a method attribute. The action is the URL, the endpoint where we need to send our request to, where the web server is listening for our request. And the second, the method, is the type of request getting made. We want to post data to the form at this address, to this action. Okay, so this is all the data that we had hard coded inside of the index.html. So at this point, we should be able to go ahead and test this out again. Let me go back. Let me refresh. Okay, so I've refreshed my page. I have my form. Let's do this again. Let's do test 2. Let's do email@email.com. We'll put, this is what, like goal 3, using JS to define attributes. Let's submit. And notice we got a response back. So we know we were successful in sending a request to our server. And in fact, if I go back over here to, I see now I have 3 responses. Here I have TED2. I have, this is aggregating, so I'm getting the second email at email.com. And here I have goal 3, using JavaScript to define attributes. That's perfect. Okay, let's move on to the next goal then, because we were successful now with setting our data using JavaScript, but it's not quite where we want it to be. So let's define our next goal. Our next goal is we want to use JavaScript to define the action query string. Well, I don't like this word action, but what we want to do here is we want to use JavaScript to define our query string that effectively encodes the data that we're sending to the server's endpoint that is going to go ahead and receive. So right now we're requiring the form to encapsulate the data by giving it the name value pair. But what we're going to do on this step is we're going to encapsulate the data ourselves inside of JavaScript. So we're no longer dependent on the HTML form to do that. And again, what we're slowly doing on each of these goals is we're stripping away built-in behavior we're relying on the HTML form to do, and we're starting to do it more ourselves through JavaScript. So our approach here is we're going to use JavaScript to encode our data as a query string. We've kind of seen this already on lab 1. We were encoding data into a query string so that we can send it to another client page as part of the URL string. But the real use case of these query strings is to send data to servers. Because recall, clients aren't supposed to directly connect to other clients. They're supposed to connect to web servers. So we were kind of using a hack to be able to send data from one client page to another through hrefs. So we're going to use a similar strategy that we used in lab 1 to send our data from our client to our web server. So this iteration will handle encoding data into the query string sent by the HTML form. The objective is to start constructing the HTTP request without depending on the form's built-in logic. With this approach, we decide what data to include in the request, but also depend on the form submit to trigger the HTTP request. So again, what we're going to do here is we've already defined our attributes in JavaScript. Now we're going to encapsulate the data, but the submit event we're still going to require from the HTML side to actually send that request to the server. We'll wait to the next goal to figure out how to send request objects from JavaScript exclusively. So here, a query string, you can read more about query strings here. I give you reference, but we've talked about them a little bit, and the lecture definitely covers that really well in depth. URL object. So JavaScript does have built in a URL object, which is used to manage URLs in query strings. I think we saw a little bit of that in lab 1. So that was a bit of a taste for this lab. And then we're going to use what's called Encode Uri Component. This, again, is going to be a JavaScript method that encodes text strings into URIs. So the things that are encoded inside of our address bar to try and try and see how data transmits into a URL. Okay, perfect. So there's no steps in HTML. We're going to do everything just in JavaScript. So we're going to actually do 4 different steps for this goal. We're going to refactor the submit event to get input values from the DOM and pass them to the function in our model script. We'll define a send to Google DB. It's called form here, but I think I renamed it to send to Google database function that manages operations of sending our data to the Google form. We'll create a get URL function that converts a path into a URL and encodes the data into a query string. And then we'll define a init request function that will initialize our HTTP request with an action and a method. Remember, the action is the URL and the method is going to be the post verb that we use. So for step one, we're going to go into our controller script and we're going to create a key value pair to associate each entry name with its corresponding input value from the text input. And we're going to send that object to a method in the model that is going to be responsible for sending it to the Google form. So let me go ahead and so we're going to update our submit event logic. So let me go into my controller. Let's get into my source code. Let me go into my controller here. So this submit event is going to get completely updated. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new object, a new empty object called form data. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have as a key to form data entry 1, which is defined inside of my model, right? So this will be the key. And the value of that key is, well, I'm going to use a document object to get an element by ID. I'm going to get the input field that has the ID name, and I'm going to grab the value. So the thing that the user typed into there, and I'm going to assign that into this object. And then for entry 2, I'm going to get the value of what's at the email text field. And then for entry 3, for the key, I'm going to get the value of what's inside the message. So actually, let me comment this out right now. And let me do a return form data here so we can actually see what this looks like. So if I hop on over here, let me go to view developer tools. So let me go to my developer tools. Let me go hit the back button here and do a refresh. So what did I call this? Submit event. So let's see what happens when I do the submit event right now. Oh, and actually, let me give some names. Name. Let me do name 1. User at email, and this is a message. Okay, so now when I go ahead and invoke that, you can see, yeah, entry.178, like this entry key has the value of name 1. This key here has the value user at email.com. And this entry key here now has, this is a message. See, all encapsulated into just an object, a key value pair, which is effectively just an object in JavaScript. Perfect. Okay, so let me go back into my source code and let's actually then invoke this function called post to Google DB, and we're going to send it that object. So this doesn't exist yet. This is going to be the next thing we're going to implement. So our next step is inside of our model script. We're going to use the form ID to get a path. Well, let's see. Let's actually take this code and we'll explain it line by line. So let's go into our form model here. And here I'm going to create a function called post to Google database. It's going to require that data to be passed in. So it's looking for that parameter. Then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and get the path from that get path function we got. Now the get path function gets me back this path, but now for this goal, I also want to append to that the search parameter string, the parameter string that has the key value pair of our entry dot, like whatever this is, that's our key, and then whatever name was placed to that, right? So whatever our form data is, we need to convert into a query string. So we're going to create a new function that's going to be called Git Url, where we pass in the path and then also the data that we want to append onto the path in the form of a query string. And then we're going to initialize our request. So another function we need to create that we want to initialize as a post to this URL that we've created. So let's see what these next two methods are going to look like. Let's first start by doing this Git URL, which will actually create the path and data appended to that path. I'm going to put this under here. So Git URL is going to be a function that's going to require a path and a set of parameters. So what we're going to do here is on our path, we're going to create a URL object. So this is a built-in class on the browser that creates URL objects that have very specific functions that allows us to convert this into a URL for sending requests and responses. So now that I have a URL object that goes to this path to the Google backend service, I am then going to iterate. I'm going to do a for loop to iterate over each key inside of our parameters, inside of our form data. And from that URL object, I have search parameters. I want to set a key value pair. So we've seen this before in lab 1. So we're using the same strategy we used in lab 1 to produce a search parameter onto our string. And then we're going to return that URL. And then once we have that URL, which is both our path and our data, we will then send that to this function init request, which will go ahead and submit it and submit it as a request. So here, this is supposed to be our HTTP request. Let's take a look at this function. So I have a function called init request. It takes in a verb. The verb that we're passing in here when we invoke it is post, and then it's going to take a URL. The URL we're going to get is the one generated by that helper method. Then I'm going to just grab the contact form from the document object model, and I'm going to set the action attribute to be the URL, the string of the URL, and I'm going to set the verb, which is what we passed in. So it's going to be post. And just to test this out also, I'm going to do a console.log on this URL so we can see what this URL looks like. So let me do URL, and also, yeah, we'll actually do URL toString actually to see what that toString method looks like. And I think that's it. We can just test that out. So let me refresh this page. And so now let me put test name. Let me put user@email.com. This is a test of encoding data in JavaScript. And I'm going to submit onto this. And I got a contact form. Excellent. Let me go back here to my responses. And yeah, look at this. I got a new response where I have my test name, I have my email address, and I have the message. This is a test of encoding data in JavaScript. Now, unfortunately, since I had sent that, I didn't get my console log, but you can imagine, let me see if we can't test what it looks like by calling. Let me go back and let's actually put some data in here so we can see. Test name, user@email. This is a message. And let's see what happens here if I were to call directly Git URL. So in order to do that, I need a path. So let me do this. Let me contact form. No, don't want to do that. Let's do everything here instead of this. Let me see if I can't just do a submit event, post to Google DB. Let's see if I do submit event, what happens if I invoke that directly. Okay, perfect. So you'll see this is what the URL looks like with our data encoded into it. Because again, you'll notice this last time when we implement it, we didn't add name attributes, right, to our form. Our form doesn't have, if we go back here, when we do a submit, we're not using the HTML form to submit that. We've encoded it in the URL here. So you see the first half of this URL is going to be the sending it to the endpoint, but then it's going to create that question mark. And then it has entry, it has key value pair. So the key equal, and then the entry, the value, and then the entry, and then the value. This is a message. So you can see all the data we're sending to the back end server is publicly exposed inside of our path. So this isn't a secure way to send data. This is a way to send data using search parameters, but it exposes all the data as being very public. So keep that in mind. Excellent. And so there's just one last step. So what I think I'm going to do in favor of keeping this lab as one video, because it doesn't make sense to separate this into two videos, I'm going to continue with the last step. But if any of you have to leave, since we're a little over time already, you'll have the opportunity to see me step through this through the video. So don't feel compelled to necessarily stay, but I will go ahead and finish out this last iteration so that it's easier for viewability later on. So with that said, there's one last step that we need to do to completely transition outside of using HTML in any way to send data to our backend web server and rely exclusively on JavaScript to do it. And that's to go ahead and actually send the submit event using JavaScript. And so here, with that being our goal being to send an HTTP request using asynchronous JavaScript, we'll learn how to use the async and await keywords. So here our approach is we'll use JavaScript to instantiate and send our HTTP requests for our backend service. This iteration will handle instantiating the HTTP request exclusively in JavaScript. We won't use an HTML form at all. In fact, we'll remove the form tag so we don't trigger a submit event. And so we'll use the JavaScript fetch request method alongside the async await keywords to be able to issue this via JavaScript. So some things you should know about, I linked to all of the API documentation for what we'll be using if you want to read deeper about it. So we're going to be using a request object. So again, that's built into the browser, it's built in as part of the API spec so that JavaScript has built-in support for sending HTTP objects to web servers. We'll learn how to use the fetch method to send a request to a web server. And then we're going to learn the keywords async and await that allows us to define a function that's asynchronous, which means that we can await for it to finish processing before continuing on. So the first thing we want to do inside of our HTML steps is we want to remove those form tags and replace them with div tags, because we're no longer going to use the built-in functionality that forms supply to us. So here I'm going to go to index.html and I'm going to replace this as a div. And now what I'm going to do, my JavaScript steps that I'm going to do for this step is going to consist of 5 separate steps. I'm going to refactor my send to Google database to send a request. I'm going to use an async function that's going to get the request and fetch it to the server and return back the response object from that server. I'm going to, as step 3, instantiate a request object with the URL and HTTP verb. For step 4, I'm going to create a callback function for the response event that sends some alert message, a success message to the user to let us know on our own page that we successfully submitted to Google form, because we're not going to do that redirect anymore. We're not going to get the Google redirect. And then the 5th and final step for this goal is we're going to refactor our event listener to a button element instead of a form element. Okay. So let's start by refactoring our post to Google database function. So let's go to our form model here. And here I have my Google post to Google database. Here I'm going to refactor it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the path like I was before. Then I'm going to get the encoded data. So I'm going to put that search parameter and get a URL. So the URL is a combination of the path along with the search parameters or query string. And then I'm going to invoke the send request method that doesn't exist yet. So we're about to build that. It's going to be an asynchronous method. It's going to require 2 things. It's going to require the method that, which is, we're going to use a post method, and it's going to include the URL endpoint, the action we want to have send to our web server. And then in response, so when this is done processing, we can do a then function. A then function it registers a callback function. So again, this is a higher order function. The thing that we're passing here is going to be a function itself. And the then method is used for asynchronous calls. When this is done processing, then it will trigger this response as a callback to that. And it'll automatically send to that response, the response object. We can actually play around with that a little bit as well. So that is an example of an asynchronous call. So then the next thing we want to do is actually let's implement that send request function. So I'm going to replace init function with this send request because we're going to do this entirely through JavaScript now. So this send request is going to use the keyword async. We know to make a function asynchronous, it has at least one function that we have to wait for. So, or one function call, one method that we have to await for. And so here, the method that we have to wait for is the fetch method, because that's an asynchronous method itself. And the fetch method can send a request object to a server, and then the server will send back a response. So since we want to wait for that response to come in on our JavaScript, then we have to declare this function itself as async. So if I ever want to use an await, I have to declare the function that's awaiting async. That's the rules. So during the function declaration, I use the async keyword. And again, we use the verb and URL. We're going to build a request. We're going to build a request object. And with the request object, I'm going to init request. I guess I shouldn't delete that function because that's going to initialize the request object and return it back to us. And our request object requires that verb and it requires that URL. And then we're going to send that request using this fetch method to the server, the web server, and the web server is going to give back a response. And then we're going to return back that response that we get back. And so that response that we get back would then be given to the response event function that gets triggered here. So now let's actually go and update or refactor our init request function. So here, our init request function is just going to be a function that takes in a verb and a URL. We're going to create a new object that will have all of the initialization that a request object will need. So things that the request object is going to need is going to be a URL. And then, so there's two parameters. It needs the URL object, and then it needs an object that contains a key value pair of things that the request is going to send to the server. That's going to be things like its method type. So we'll have a method that will have the verb either post or put or get or delete. We want to send a post method. We're going to send a mode. Our mode that we're going to do is going to be no cores. That's for cross-origined scripts. Since we're testing this on the client side and our client is separate from the server, we want to ensure that the mode allows us to send no cores requests so that we can actually submit this. Otherwise, we might get a failure if we don't have this. We'll actually remove this and test this out to see what happens. And then built into our browser API is the ability to create request objects. So I'm just going to initialize a new request object that has the URL object and has these essentially these parameters that we've put inside this object that has a method and it has a mode. And then once we have that request object, we can send that to the fetch. So notice we are building this inside of the init request. It's going to send back an actual request object, and we can send that request object using a fetch. And then once we do that, we need to define what that response event is. So let's go ahead and do that. That's going to be inside of our model. Right here, we're going to alert success. Actually, let's do something else. Let's do a console.log and print out the response that we get back. And then we'll update that later. So here, and again, this gets called after the send request gets done processing because we registered it as a callback using the then method. And again, that's another way we can do asynchronous programming. Okay, and then after we've set up what our response event is going to be, let's go ahead and actually update our initial init controllers method inside of our controllers, because now we're no longer setting up for a submit event, right? Here we want to set up for like a button click. So here we're going to grab the submit button, which is here, right? So we have this button that has submit, and we're going to add an event listener on a click instead of submit. Now everything is handled in JavaScript, right? On a click event, we're going to trigger the submit event that we defined here. So let's refresh our page. Let's put test name here, test name. We'll put user@email.com, and this is the last step. Let's do a submit here, and look, I got a response object here. See, so this response came back from the server. And notice I didn't do any redirect. So actually in my response event, if I want to do other things, actually, let's go back and see if I actually captured that data. So let's go, oh, I have 5 responses, test name. I have, this is the last step. So here, notice we actually were able to do an entire submit purely from JavaScript. And in fact, let's do that test like I was saying before, actually. Let me go back into my code here. And like, what if when we were building our request, we didn't do this mode? What if I omitted this cores? So let's do that. Let's comment that out and see, is that necessary? Let me do a refresh. Let me do a username. Let's do user@email. And this is with no mode of no cores. I'm going to submit that. And look at this. Access to fetch failed. And why did it fail? Because look at this. I have origin is null, has been blocked by CORS policy. CORS policy is a security thing that browsers have implemented. CORS stands for cross origin request script. And that means when we try to go ahead and send, have 2 different JavaScripts to send data on a server, that's not also on the server. So right now we're trying to write into the server from our client, which isn't Google server. So by default, it doesn't allow that. So I can add a part of my request. I can add a mode where I don't look for this cross origin request script. And so that'll allow me to send post from a server that's outside of the domain of where the server scripts are running. So we'll kind of see this again in the future when we start doing backend implementation, but that's what's going to happen if we don't add that as part of the request. So notice this is something that gets triggered from the JavaScript side and not from the HTML side, which is why we didn't have to set a mode inside the HTML element. And again, this is for security reasons because JavaScript is a programming language and HTML is a declarative language. It's not. So these are safety specifications to try to prevent actors who are not trustworthy from doing bad things. So it's a security protocol, but to be able to just work around there, we have an option to add a mode type to our request when it does not belong on the same server, when our script is on a different server, so that we can still send that post. And here, what I can do is instead of sending the fetch, let me do this. Let me do a console log so we can see what that request looks like as well. That request. Okay, so let's inspect that request element. So let me do a refresh here. Let me do username, user@email. This is a message and a submit. And yeah, here's my request. And so notice the request object is essentially just it's a class built into JavaScript, and it's going to have all the necessary data required to send an HTTP request. It's going to have a method with that HTTP verb. It's going to have a URL, which is effectively the endpoint that we're sending the data. And in this instance, that URL also encapsulates the data. So that this is just a head, but usually HTTP requests can also have a head and a body. We'll learn more about that in the next lab, how we can actually go ahead and send our data as a body that can be unpacked by the web server. or we'll probably look at that when we start building our own web servers. And then you'll see there's other things like headers and refers and all these other attributes that are predefined for us by JavaScript, by the request class, so that we don't have to worry about that ourselves. So you see our mode is in there, no cores. And so this just gives us all the information we need to send a web request and then get back that response. So let me fix this so it's, and just as a, let me fix that. And let's say I wanted to make my own page. So if this is for your portfolio page, maybe my response would be to access the document objects body dot inner HTML and just set that to be blank. So here, or something like data submitted. So let me refresh that. And here, let me do this again. Username, user at email. This is a message. Let me submit that. And notice, bam, you'll see. Now, instead of doing a redirect to Google, if I wanted to, I could just rewrite the contact form page with whatever HTML content I want, like we've done previously. And now you can have your own data submitted page on your portfolio page. So with this lab, you can now actually do your own update to your portfolio page. One last thing I would recommend, though, if you were to do that, is if you go to the responses here, they have an option. If you hit the 3 dots, so that you can select to get an email notification for each new response. And if you do that, and this is attached to your portfolio page, you'll also get an email sent to you whenever someone submits. So you don't have to look at the form, you'll be notified. And then that's what you're looking for, a contact form. So this is a free way to get a contact form functional on your portfolio page. And without anyone being the wiser that you're effectively using a Google form to do that. Excellent. And we are done with this lab. We will do the next lab starting next week. Excellent. Thank you for all who have decided to stay around and watch the entirety of this. I'll be posting this for those who couldn't on Moodle and inside of Discord. Excellent. Is there any questions about this lab before I end the video?
I think that's all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, let's stop this recording.